Following is my interview with my friend Ben Kuhn. Ben is the CTO of Wave, a company building financial services for unbanked people in sub-Saharan Africa. We talk about productivity, his college experience, job choice, the value of an inside view, the EA community, and a bunch of other topics. If you enjoyed our conversation, be sure to check out Ben's blog, as well as open roles at Wave. Enjoy! Hey Ben,
Hi, how's it going?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great. Excited.
Cool. So, how has your winter been? I remember this post from fall of 2019 where you mentioned that you installed this really bright lamp in your in your office, and that it almost, I don't know whether it blinded you, but it made your room a lot brighter. So, have you been less? Has your mood been better this winter?
So this winter, I actually had a different strategy. So my partner and I decided to become nomadic because we were paying like way too much for a crappy apartment near Harvard Square, which is like a reasonable decision when there are things going on in the Cambridge area, and not a reasonable decision when there's a pandemic and nothing is happening. I am currently in El Paso, Texas, which actually is like a super awesome place, at least to stay while you don't like want to spend any time with people. I have no friends in like El Paso, so if I would otherwise be interacting with friends, like I might not like it as much. But anyway, I'm staying in El Paso, but I'm keeping East Coast hours so that I can continue like working with the people that I work with in Senegal and on the East Coast, which means that I like wake up slightly before sunrise and I go to bed slightly before sunset. And that, combined with our house having a very large number of windows, like sometimes in silly places, but it lets in a lot of light, means that I haven't been missing my ultra bright light that much. I did take the ultra bright light with me, but it turns out that it's kind of hard to set it up like in Airbnbs in a place where it both like illuminates the room properly, but also isn't blinding.
Right.
I keep hoping somebody will start a company that makes like versions of this light that are like actually good. And as in like you can put them in a room and it's like easy to place them in a place such that they like illuminate the room, but do not blind you, but nobody's done it yet.
So the first thing that I wanted to ask you about, I guess it's sort of it's direct continuation of the topic of like productivity, but I guess it's more direct. But one of the posts of yours that your blog is just really good, but one of the posts in particular that I keep thinking about is the one on you managing to increase your productivity by 50% in 1 month by noticing that you're spending a lot of time on Slack and that you're spending a lot of time doing like random things during the day when like they should be batched and like other things like that. So this was written like 5 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
How has this post aged?
I think that if my output were mainly code, it would still be pretty much like accurate. Fortunately or unfortunately, my output is no longer mostly code. I like my primary output is now like a well-functioning engineering team. And it's a lot harder to figure out what actions are productive or unproductive, like along that axis. So for instance, if my primary output is technical work, then it makes a lot of sense to try to batch all of my meetings to like particular times of day so that I can have as much time heads down programming as I want. But if my output is a well-functioning engineering team, then actually like the cost of delaying a meeting to a point where it might be batched with other things could be quite high, because that means that I can't use the information that I learned in that meeting for like the rest of my day. So it's a lot harder to optimize productivity by just like looking at rescue time stats and being like, how do I make these numbers go up? than it was when I was mainly a programmer. Also, like, rescue time is much better at telling you, are you or are you not programming, than like, now, like, you know, like, for like 70% of my time is like communication and scheduling. What does that mean? I don't know. Rescue time can't even really tell. Rescue time, yeah, if you like are on if you're in a meeting but you're looking at another document, right, it completely screws up your rescue time statistics, for instance. So, but even if the statistics weren't screwed up, I think that there are a lot of, like, now I have like problems. Oh, some of my meetings are incredibly useful and some of them are useless and stuff. It's a lot harder to take like a purely statistical view of my productivity, I think, than it used to be.
Right. So sort of it has the vibes of the whole Kagan's thing of rationality and meta-rationality, where you try to just maximize the thing, versus no, everything is so hard. You just try to get a taste of what's important and try to do these things.
Yeah, actually, so maybe I would say the like aged version of that post is my blog post on my weekly review habit, which like has largely I think weekly reviews have largely replaced rescue time as like the thing that tells me, am I being productive? As in, I can't just look at statistics anymore. I have to spend a lot of time like staring at the ceiling and being like, was this a productive week? What did I actually do? Rescue time can't tell me that anymore. If there is a habit that has increased my productivity by 50% recently, it would definitely be weekly reviews. Yeah, gosh, I guess my subject matter hasn't really changed in the past 5 years.
How have your weekly reviews, or, well, there are so many different directions, but like, how have your weekly reviews evolved since you started doing them?
Yeah, quite a lot. So I think for a long time, they were mostly focused on habit improvements and like life system improvement stuff. And that I think that type of weekly review actually synergized quite well with looking at rescue time, because you can look at rescue time and then be like, why was this number so high? What can I do to like get it lower? And oh, it turns out that I should be keeping my phone in a different room so that it like doesn't distract me or something. I think that like recently I've noticed that they have started taking a lot longer. I think largely because I spend less of them on that type of like low hanging fruit like habit tweak, and more of them just like thinking about stuff, where stuff is, or I don't know, like there are, I guess I like a lot of my job now, or a lot more of my job now involves solving like problems where I can't automatically apply like a thing that I already know how to do. And so I just need to spend a lot of time thinking about, oh, we need a new manager for this team. Let me go through all of the candidates in my head and like figure out like whether I think they would be like good or bad or like something like that. Or, oh, like I need to improve this like system at Wave, or this process at Wave. Let me go, like I'm not very good at designing processes yet, so it takes me like a long time to think about it. Anyway, I guess like I spend a lot less of my time in weekly reviews now, like brainstorming random habit improvements, and the format has shifted more towards I write down a couple of things that are on my mind, and then I like go for a really long walk and think about them. I think like I don't know. Theoretically, there's enough time in my schedule that I could like devote. I could spend time during the week like thinking about stuff also, and in fact, like I do. But somehow, I guess maybe this is like a similar phenomenon to what happens in engineering, but somehow having time to think like on the weekend makes my brain less likely to slide off of a difficult problem and go to like oh, what am I going to say in the meeting that's happening in 4 hours or something like that.
Yeah, that's, yeah, I definitely feel very similarly about weekly, like thinking during the weekends versus thinking during the weekdays. Yeah, I think, or for me, the version of this, I guess, is that I do my weekly reviews on Sunday, and on Sunday, I'm just like explicitly prohibited from doing any work on the main project that I'm working on. So there's all of the, because I know all of the things are like cannot possibly be as important as weekly review.
Yeah.
Then, and like they're none of them are urgent. Yeah, it makes focusing on these things easier. It's sort of, I feel like there's a pretty strong connection to like how I think in the shower for me is much easier, because I know that if I come in, I'm going to spend like 30 minutes there. I know that I'm going to be able to just think only about the thing, the problem at hand, and not be distracted by anything else. And like Sundays kind of work like this as well.
It's funny. I posted an essay, or I wrote an essay recently where I like mentioned the like having my best ideas in the shower or something, and like, I posted it on Twitter, and one of the replies was like, "Oh, have you ever considered like taking baths instead?" And it was like a joke, but also I hadn't considered it, and I feel like I probably should have considered it. And so I didn't start taking baths, but I did start taking a lot more walks, and I think that was like pretty good for getting more time like during the week to think about tricky things. Also, another reason that having mountains in your backyard is great. It makes taking walks like a lot more enjoyable.
Yeah. So how has he, or from one of your, or like I guess I don't need to reference one of your old posts in every question, but you've always been an engineer, and you've always been like doing technical work and like, I guess, hands-on technical work, and you've transitioned to being a manager over the last, I guess, couple of years. And how has this transition been working for you? And did you expect that or like, are you enjoying it as much as being a software engineer? Did you expect when you were graduating college that this is how things would turn out?
I definitely did not expect it to turn out this way. I think in terms of enjoyment, I would say that, so like in happiness studies, people will often differently measure like day-to-day happiness versus like life satisfaction.
Right.
I would say that my like life satisfaction is much higher, but my like day-to-day happiness has probably gone down like somewhat. I don't know. It's like really hard to beat the dopamine fueled feedback loop haze of writing like a bunch of code.
And instead you need to think about hard problems that do not have defined solutions all the time, rather than just like being into this loop of coding.
Yeah. However, I don't know. It's like I think that my like overall I think the impact that I'm having on the world is like much higher because I'm like working, like I'm like building the team that builds the thing instead of just building the thing. There's like a big force multiplier from doing that and like, doing it effectively. And that means that like when I look back on any given period of time, I'm like, wow, Wave really did a bunch of awesome stuff, and I'm like really proud of that. And to be clear, I was proud of my programming work for Wave too. But like I don't know, being able to see the effects of having an entire team of people that's like amazing, and being able, I've been recently thinking about this a lot because it was performance review season at Wave, and one of the funny things that I realized about, we explicitly prioritize hiring people who are very excited about our mission, but also very like low ego. And this means that like one of the most frequent pieces of feedback that I give during performance reviews is to tell people that they should have more confidence in their own ability, which is just, obviously like this has downsides, right? If like everybody, if you hire a bunch of people who are like extremely competent and have very little ego, like this is basically like a recipe for people to have like imposter syndrome, because they see everyone around them who's incredibly competent. They don't realize that they are equally competent. And in fact, like that's in some sense like a downside of having this value, but it does make performance reviews just like actually a really joyful time, because I can just be like, my job is just to tell people that they're like more awesome than they think.
Right.
Anyway, and so being able to see this entire team of people become more awesome over time is like quite satisfying, even if like day to day it involves a lot of being in meetings. And I guess I would also say, I think one of the most striking things about the transition between programming and being a manager is that like I think that there was a much stronger dip in my like day-to-day happiness initially, which then corrected over time, which largely because when I first started being a manager, I did not have any instinct at all for which activities am I doing today that will actually be valuable. Because this is the thing that people commonly say about management versus programming, is that like your feedback loop goes from like hours for getting your tests to pass, or like days for like getting something into production. It goes from hours or days to like weeks, months, and years. And so initially I was just like, like I have no idea whether anything I'm doing is useful. I feel like I'm flailing around and it's pointless. But as I gained more experience and saw those initial decisions play out over the full like feedback loop time horizon, I ended up getting a much better intuition for, this meeting where I gave somebody like feedback that they found really useful, like this actually was an incredibly productive management activity that's going to make them slightly more effective over the course of the next 6 months. And so I can sort of like back propagate the dopamine hits from 6 months down to a shorter time scale. And so I think I guess there have actually been like multiple of these transitions where basically like every time your time horizon lengthens, you end up feeling that you're like flailing around for a little while until like a period of like n time horizons passes. And then you start to figure out and be able to predict like the impact of your decisions that you make in the moment.
Right. Yeah, but the thing that I'm thinking about right now is that I had, so my last post was about management and how people who we now think of great leaders did not necessarily were not necessarily good leaders when they started out, and like Elon Musk used to just have no idea what to do with management, or like Steve Jobs had ended up being, or I guess like he ended up not being the CEO, and then the guy who had a ton of experience came in to Apple pretty early, and then hired everyone, and then it took Steve Jobs like 10 or 15 years to actually learn how to manage people. So your transition is interesting to me in light of all of this, and again, like from the perspective of someone technical, shifting into management job and feeling like, I flailing around and have no idea what to do, and then no, it's actually, it makes sense, and it seems that I'm getting pretty good at it, and it's actually satisfying. Yeah.
I think I think an interesting thing with I think many of the people that you mentioned in this post, and also some other managers that I have observed, and I guess like myself, is like specifically being like interpersonally difficult to work with, and learning how to like or like specifically the reason that they're a bad manager is just that they're kind of a jerk, right? Like Steve Jobs is like the classic example of this. But many, I think Elon Musk also is kind of like famously difficult to be managed by because he can be a jerk, or at least was at various points. I have not been extensively following people's reviews of his management. Anyway, yeah, I guess this makes me curious, like maybe the underlying trait is like that, like these people are like very neurotic, I think, and learning how to, what they do over time is they learn how to like productively channel their neuroticism. I guess I wouldn't compare myself to, I don't want to compare my overall abilities to like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, obviously, but I do think this has been like my number one challenge with learning how to be, I guess, considered like an okay manager by my reports, which I think was also true for Drew, the CEO of Wave, who's also, I have like loved working with him as a manager, but one thing that we both struggled with that I also saw in that post is basically like people learning how to like use their neuroticism productively rather than just like flipping the shit at everyone.
Right. Yeah. So what are the aspects of being a manager do you feel are you still do not have a good grip on?
Oh, tons. I still am like far from perfect at like productively being neurotic, like productively instead of like non-productively. Like when I was so as a programmer, like I am very fast at like reading an error message and being like, oh, I bet I know what is causing this. And sometimes other engineers that I work with are like not as fast, perhaps because they have not been practicing that skill for like 6 years or whatever. And so sometimes people will ask for my help for something, and like, I think it's like clear from the error. They're like, oh, like how do I fix this error message? And to me, it seems clear from the error message, like what's going on. But to them, it's not, because like they're less good at interpreting arcane error messages than I am, which is like understandable. Like when I was like a younger programmer and like a very bad manager, I would often get like, I was going to say I would often get annoyed. I think that's like a little bit of a strong description. I would often be like momentarily annoyed. I'd be like, like why can't everybody interpret these error messages? But it turns out that's not a productive thing to be neurotic about. If I just bugged everybody whenever they like asked for help on an error message that I think they should have been able to interpret correctly, that's not really productive. It just is going to make them like annoyed, because like there are more important things to like, coach them on. And so, however, on the flip side, if I never coached anyone on how to, if I just let it go, anytime somebody did something that I thought they could have done better at, I wouldn't be a good coach for them. I wouldn't be helping them improve. And so like figuring out the balance of, that's what I mean by productively channeling your neuroticism, is I guess like part of the reason that I have become a good engineer is that I like pay attention to those things when I'm doing them and get really annoyed when like I do them wrong, but I can't be as annoyed at everybody else as like I am at myself. And so figuring out the balance of like when to actually give people feedback on something and when to just be like, this isn't the most important thing to talk about, is I think one of the things that I've been learning a lot about, and I'm still learning. And to be clear, it's not just like the axis that you need to work on is not just like how often do you give people do you give people improvement feedback? There's a second axis, which is like how often do you give people like positive feedback, which for many like high neuroticism people, the answer is like almost never, right? Because you view doing things right as, yeah, like that's what I'm paying you for. You wouldn't be here if you didn't do most things. But if you only tell people when they do something wrong, then they have a bias. You're giving them a biased sample of what you think of them overall. And so that's something that I've been like trying to improve at recently. Anyway.
Yeah. You asked not to be compared with Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, but I have to note that your example is remarkably similar to the example Elon Musk gave when he was asked about his personal struggles of being a manager, with him like noticing the problem earlier, noticing a technical problem earlier than someone who he was a manager to, and he just learned to let people solve the problems and guide them rather than just like blurt out the solution, because it turns out that this is just there's no way to learn if you like you just do this. So you have this transition from being a software engineer to being a manager, but one of the things that I think you've been doing for a while that is usually associated with being a manager is conducting one-on-ones. You've been, you had this post, which I also think a lot about doing one-on-ones with your partner, and you mentioned that you noticed that grad school is just like terribly structured, like totally not optimized for like actually making people feel good and accomplish things, and that just like by starting to conduct weekly one-on-ones with your partner about her thesis, you like helped her a lot with it. And was this like, did the things that you do in the process of doing one-on-ones with your partner carry out to the things you ended up doing as a manager?
I think it's been that's a good question. I think that my partner doesn't have the same type of personality as many people that we hire to Wave as software engineers. So some of them have definitely been the same, right? Like part of one-on-ones is just like getting more comfortable talking to the other person so that you can have difficult discussions together. That happens with everybody. But for instance, like my partner was pretty shy when we started dating, and like one of the most useful like questions that I could ask her in one-on-ones is like, hey, so have you sent that email to that person yet? And she'd be like, no, I should probably do that. And I think compared to like the typical Wave employee, she's probably like 95th to 99th percentile shyness or something. So I spend a lot less time like nudging other Wave employees to send people Slack messages or something like that. Not zero time, but a lot less. I think so. Also the one-on-ones that we had while she was working on her thesis were actually closer to a status meeting than some business-focused one-on-ones, as in we would just talk about her thesis. So one of the rules that people often give you for like one-on-ones in a company context is you should actually not talk about current projects, because you should have other meetings for that. It should be your time for your report to talk about whatever they want. In relationships, that's kind of flipped. Like most of the time you're talking about whatever you want. And so I don't think they were, I guess they were fairly different on that axis.
Right. Yeah. So your partner finished her PhD, and I think you mentioned on Twitter that she is now, I guess, switching careers.
Yeah.
and has through this transition, have you been, did you continue doing one-on-ones? Have they been as helpful? If yes?
Yeah, so currently we are actually spending less time in one-on-ones focusing on her like career plans because we realized that basically so we're generally like quite different in various ways, and for a while I was the only person whom Eve was talking to about this, and like I tend to be, or I would tend to be like I guess I would it was hard for me to do the correct amount of stepping back and not being opinionated, basically, because we were at such different career stages where Eve is like trying to figure out which among like lots and lots of different like possible options like to do. Basically, like I think figuring that out requires like a lot of introspection that like probably shouldn't be biased by what one particular person will think of the outcome. And I think it was like hard for me like not to bias her if we like talked about it like too much or at too high of a frequency. And so we actually like stepped back from talking too much about that in our one-on-ones, at least. Or I guess my basic rule is I shouldn't be like talking to her about it like disproportionately more than like other people. I think because there are ways in which she's like quite different from me that it's hard for me to imagine, it's hard for me to simulate or imagine or give good advice like taking those into account. And there might be other people that are like better at giving advice or like better like role models for her, assuming she does not want to become like the CTO of a software company, which I don't think she does.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I feel like I have something similar with my wife, where I think, yeah, where we'll also like clearly seem to be enjoying just like different kinds of work, and it's like actually difficult, surprisingly difficult to emphasize with that, and with the thing that I've been encouraging. So I have this thing where I've been like sending people cold emails, or like I've been hanging out on the internet since I was like 12, and I've been sending people cold, like really poor cold emails, but still cold emails since I was like 16. And I have this habit of just like, if I see someone interesting on the internet, or if I see someone who I want to meet, I can just email them, and there's like a reasonable chance that they actually want to talk to me. And one of the things that I now try to encourage Nastya more, is to just, is there a person who you want to meet and who you would enjoy talking to, and who you might want to like share career advice, or who like might be helpful to you, who you just want to become friends with, and let's just sit down and write to that person, because they might actually be helpful with whatever it is you're trying to do, which I probably like have absolutely no insight with. And I think this has been, we probably should have started doing this earlier.
You mean you should have started doing the basically like the meta level of like talk to other people instead of just trying to talk it through your, yeah, I strongly agree with this. I think if you try to give your partner or at least for me, when I was like trying to give Eve too much like explicit advice. I ended up giving her like advice about how to become like a mini version of myself instead of the best version of her own self. And so, yeah, I guess which, I mean, I'm sure that I also do that in like work one-on-ones, right? But in work one-on-ones, like it makes more sense to do that, at least to some extent, because like most of my reports are trying to become like more effective software engineers and or managers.
Right.
Whereas Eve is not. So that's another relevant disanalogy, I guess.
Yeah. So Eve finished her PhD in like philosophy, and it took like quite a few years. Like, do you think it was, and like given the fact that she now is transitioning to a different career, do you think it was a mistake to finish the PhD?
So I'm guessing that so at the time that like, so I actually tried, or I raised the possibility to Eve that she should drop out. I think a couple years before she finished, or maybe it was only 1 year before she finished. Like at that point, I think that her take was that like basically it was worth finishing because there were only a couple years left. But if she had known when she was looking for PhDs, like what it would entail and like what she knew now, then it like wouldn't have been worth it to finish. So I think like the reason that it was worth finishing at that point was, so if you don't care about going into academia, like getting a PhD, at least in philosophy, is actually like a pretty sweet job. Like, and if you have a low cost of living, like you don't have that high of a workload, like you like make a reasonable, I think like around the median income, depending on like where you are, and you hang out with smart people a lot, and so your hourly rate, if you're not like basically like putting every waking hour into like your dissertation or succeeding at the job market, is actually like pretty good. Like the main cost of doing a PhD, like I think the main cost for Eve for doing a PhD for 7 years or whatever, I think it was 6 years of actually being in school, and she took one like gap year. But the main cost was not being able to like iterate on finding like a thing that she was more excited about doing permanently for those 6 years. And that was the fault of like academia not preparing you for anything except academia, I guess. Yeah, I don't think it was a terrible decision, like given what she knew when she was like 21 or whatever. I think like in an ideal world, she would have known like a lot more when she was 21. And then like at the point at which she like actually decided based on like good reasoning and knowing like a lot more about what a PhD was like and the job market, she was like she could drop out at that point, but she was like quite close to finishing her dissertation. It was still like a good job, and like having the credential is like plausibly helpful for like other things. And if it takes you 1 year to get the credential because of like a bunch of sunk costs that you already have instead of 6 years, then I don't know, maybe it actually is worth it. And it certainly got her parents off her back. Her dad is a philosophy professor. So
yeah. So you finished undergrad in 3 years, and you were so impatient with college that you like literally forgo the last year of undergrad. And so was this a good decision in retrospect? And like, how did this happen?
So I think this decision was clearly great ex post. Like, as in, if I had made a different decision, I probably would not have ended up working at Wave. And I think I'm like an unusually good fit working at Wave. I was like somewhat, I think I like, yeah, I think I was an unusually good fit working at Wave, and it's allowed me to have a lot bigger impact than I would at other randomly selected like jobs could have ended up at for like at the same time. So yeah, ex post I think it was a great decision. I think if I had been like a more effective, if I had been more effective at using college, which I don't think I was very effective at using college, and if I had been more effective, it might not have been the right decision. I think I didn't have a great idea about what college was supposed to be for. I still don't have a super great idea about what college is supposed to be for, but my guess is that like my guess is that the best way to use it is to make a lot of really smart friends. And I think I was like okay at that, but not great. And if I had been great at it, then maybe it would have been worth the extra year to have like more bonding time and have a synchronized schedule with them or something. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, I guess I spent enough time thinking about how I like what I should have done in college to like write a blog post about it. But without actually having used it effectively, like all of this is kind of guesswork.
Right.
So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think this was sort of the thing that I was also thinking about. My sort of impression of that, like college is to like have the ability to like explore your interests by taking like any like natural science and any other course you want. And like, do you want to do physics, or do you want to do math, or do you want to do chemistry, or do you want to do, or do you just want to do computer science? And to meet people who you will hopefully interact for and talk to for the rest of your life. And one of the things that I think you probably did like very right was, I think you were the person who started EA chapter at Harvard, right?
Yes.
Or you were one of the people who did it.
Yes.
And in this way, you collected like a bunch of people who are really smart and like really aligned with your point of view, in contrast to like the median person at Harvard. But at the same, so do you have ideas on what could you've done better to meet more really smart people?
I actually think Harvard specifically is like quite bad for this, for a like weirdly specific reason, which is their housing policy. So the way housing works is that you get randomly assigned to one of the, I think, 12 upperclassmen dormitories during your freshman year. And you can choose up to 7 classmates to be randomly assigned in a block to the same dormitory. And so that is, your blocking group is the only set of people that you're guaranteed to live nearby for the next 3 years. And you have to pick them sort of like midway through your freshman year. While you're also like, so that means, in practice, what this means is that like around, I forget at the exact time, it may be like December through like February of your freshman year, you're just like running around in a panic trying to like figure out like who are the people that you want to be best friends with for the next 3 years, like while simultaneously trying to like pass your like ridiculously hard courses that you're taking, because this is like your one chance to take a bunch of like ridiculously hard courses that they offer like for freshmen. Anyway, it's like not a very fun process. And it means that you make this like one incredibly high stakes decision that basically determines your friend group for the next 3 years.
This doesn't quite seem true, because you're like, you can hang out with people outside of your living block.
I think this might be another way that Harvard is like worse than many other places, is that people tend to be very busy, and there isn't very much. So I guess like the thing you get from people in your dorm that you don't get elsewhere is like the ability to spontaneously hang out. With other people, you have to like coordinate with it. You coordinate with them, and it's like kind of annoying because they have 13 different extracurriculars, and they're like too busy being like captain of the Quidditch team to like hang out with you or something. Anyway, but I think this is also maybe a cultural thing that is somewhat specific to Harvard. But even so, like also the dorms are like kind of spread out, and it's kind of like annoying to, at least Harvard, and my sense is like college students generally are like very lazy and like, don't really want to like travel to have lunch with you when they could spontaneously hang out with one of the people in like their dorm instead. In fact, like Harvard students are sufficiently lazy that like it's generally viewed as a disaster if you get randomly allocated to one of the 3 dorms that's like a 10-minute walk from campus instead of a 2-minute walk from campus. Anyway, so it doesn't completely determine your social circle, but if you like, it does lock you in quite a bit. It's not guaranteed that you'll find anyone in your dorm. It's in fact pretty unlikely that you'll find anyone in your dorm to be like roommates with you who's like better than like the people that you block with, or like a better fit with you than like the people that you block with. The other thing that's annoying about this system is that because blocking groups are randomly assigned to dorms, like dorms don't get to have their own personalities. And so it's much harder to navigate yourself to a group of larger than 8 people that like shares a bunch of like interests or like ways of thinking about stuff with you. And instead they all sort of have this like bland, like standard Harvard culture. So yeah, I guess, I don't know. I didn't expect when I was picking colleges that like housing policy would have such like a large effect on the environment. But in retrospect, like that maybe that would have been something to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry, I feel like you maybe asked there was an original question that I'm not sure I completely answered, because like Harvard's housing policy is one of my hobby horses, and I kind of went off on a tangent.
Yeah, the original question was, what could you have done better? Well, one of the things that I personally discovered, unfortunately way too late, was, so like in Russia we like enter a specific program where, so like I entered the program in mathematics and economics, and I couldn't like really take any course I want, or like I had a specific program. And one of the things that I discovered during my like 3rd year was that I could actually take any course I want. I would just have to go to the study office, and then just like, kept lying to me over like the years that I couldn't do this. And then at some point I discovered that I could do this, and then I just started going to the computer science department and hanging out there much more, or and in this way I met people who I think I should have hung out like much more during my 1st and 2nd year, and like the first half of 3rd year.
Yeah.
And like I imagine that a version of this for you could have been that instead of just going to classes at Harvard, just spend a day at MIT and hang out there and meet people there. And
yeah, definitely.
Spend
Actually,
a day a week at MIT.
Also, yeah, I don't know how that particular plan would have worked, because I think like I think geographical proximity is like so important. But I think the most effective thing that I could have done was like on that axis was just like choose somewhere with like a better like housing policy. I think MIT would have been. So actually, that's like also maybe like, I think like in general being better informed about, I'm not sure to what extent this is something I could have done better or not, but I was like super poorly informed about, I don't know, how the world worked, like when I was choosing schools. And if I had been better informed, I could have made like much better decisions. I guess one way that I think was accessible to me, in which I could have been better informed, was that I could have spent more time doing things that weren't college before going to college. So, which I think this is related to another point that you made, which is that, or it sounded like you thought that at least like in the US, where there is not this restriction on what you can do, right? College is like a good place to explore your interests. I actually think college is like a pretty garbage place to explore your interests, because you find out what it's like to take classes about your interests, but that's not actually what like your interests are going to look like for the rest of your life, unless you're like a grad student or something, unless you want to go into academia. But if you enjoy taking physics classes, okay, what does that mean? It means maybe you should go to physics grad school. What else does it mean? You don't know, because like you're a college student, right? What things can you do in the real world that use the same skills as like doing physics? I don't know. I would argue maybe actually like one of the things is like maybe like site reliability engineering at a technology company, but you're not going to know that because nobody's going to tell you that who hasn't actually done that and told you like, oh yeah, it's interestingly like physics in certain ways. Anyways, but
Right. No, that's actually a really good point, because like you learn what things you enjoy studying, but
yeah,
like not the things that you would enjoy doing, like as your career.
yeah. So I think that if you didn't care at all about the signaling benefits from like a college degree, I think it would make much more sense to not front load all of your studying about things and then all of your like trying to actually do things, and then like backload like all of your trying to actually do things, because there's like a feedback loop between those two things, where by trying to do things in the world, you learn what are your knowledge gaps that you then want to go fix by like studying things or something. The only way in which this is like socially allowed is by taking a gap year. I do think that taking a gap year, like at least for everyone I knew who took a gap year between high school and college, like they enjoyed it. I do think that the set of things you can learn about while you're taking a gap year is like pretty limited. If you happen to know how to code, then you can get a programming job, and that will teach you a lot about what programming is like. I don't really know like what else you can do. I know some like other people sometimes, I don't know, sometimes they like spend their gap year like hiking around Chile, which is like really fun, but maybe doesn't teach you that much about what you might enjoy doing for the rest of your life. So I feel like this is something where I don't have a great sense of what should replace the thing that people normally do, but it seems like it would like interesting to think about how to optimize.
Great. Yeah. How has starting the EA chapter at Harvard affected your life? And like, how would your life be different had you not done this?
Good question. I think it's hard to say to what degree any of the effects have been like persistent, other than I don't know, it got a bunch of people interested in effective altruism who like otherwise wouldn't have been, and like they're off doing cool things. And so like maybe one of the ways in which it's affected my life is like maybe it like caused a very tiny reduction in like, the chance that I get turned into paper clips by an unaligned artificial intelligence or like something like that. But in terms of the like more noticeable personal effects, I think it's kind of hard to say. I think there are a couple of ways in which it was an interesting experience that I can like claim like maybe they like affected me later, but it's unclear to what extent that's true. One is I was doing something that I was like very clearly not like the best person to do, but like I was there and like, nobody else was. I don't think I was like a particularly good, wasn't good at like logistics. I wasn't good at remembering to create Facebook events for our speakers before the day of the speaker coming. I wasn't good at giving introductions to the speakers that we had. I wasn't good at coming up with like events, but whatever, like I was the person who was like there and motivated. Anyway, so I think that made me more likely to be willing to like, I think that made me somewhat more willing to be like, okay, like even if this thing doesn't feel like and I guess the thing that I learned from that was like over time I figured out how to be like much better at it. And so I guess if I took a generalizable lesson away from that, it was like, oh, even if this thing like feels like it kind of sucks, if you keep putting one foot in front of the other, like you'll eventually like at least become passable at it. And then hopefully you can hand it off to people who are like more than passable at it, which is like what happened to Harvard Effective Altruism. And it's now run by people who are like far more competent than I ever was. Thank God. Because it would definitely be dead if it was like people of equivalent competence running it for the next 7 years. Anyway, I think this is like actually remarkably similar to what happens in like startups. And I guess one specific thing that actually was even more remarkably similar was like a lot of what I did was I sent like a bunch of cold emails to people asking them if they wanted to give talks. Because like it turned out that like having people give talks was like our best way to like, get new people interested in Harvard Effective Altruism. And so what this meant was that like I would just find like large numbers of people who seemed like even plausibly interesting, and I would just like crank out cold emails to those people, and 90% of those cold emails would get no response, or the person wouldn't be interested, and then 10% of them the person would come give a talk and we get like some new members. It turns out this is exactly like what hiring for a company looks like. You do the same thing over and over again, and 90% of the time it fails and it sucks and it's super freaking boring. And then 10% of the time you like hire an amazing person that you love working with. And so I guess that was like a good object lesson in what it feels like to like sample from a heavy-tailed distribution. And then it turns out just like being willing to draw like many samples from a heavy-tailed distribution is like a good thing to have. Also like writing blog posts, right? Another thing that's like very similar to that.
Yeah. Yeah, where like a couple of blog posts generated like half of all page views over the years.
Yep.
Yeah. So given like the fact that, so at the same time, so you went to Harvard, which is like the single most prestigious university in the world. You went to a pretty good high school in Boston, which was also like academically demanding. And then you like hang out a lot with the effective altruism community. And it seems that all of these groups are like very selected on just being like really smart. Like they're variously selected on obviously interests aligned to yours. But like these days, do you talk to a lot of people from your high school, which like was selection for being smart, but not for interest alignment? And do you talk with a lot of people you went with to Harvard, or do most people you talk to are like your coworkers and people who are involved with EA, or you like met hanging out on Lessron?
I think like the people that I talk to the most are like from a pretty random selection of, or like pretty random set of those things. My high school was like not very large. So like my class was like 35 people, of whom I'm still in touch with one-ish. Harvard, like I'm still in touch with like a few people from Harvard, a few people that I've met from like Less Wrong, a few people that I've met from like other things. I don't know, a few people that I met through like the contra dancing community, a few people. It's like, I don't think any of those things was I don't think any community that I've participated in was an excellent filter for people that I wanted to stay in touch with.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to think about. Yeah, I think okay, I guess I think like interacting with people on the internet, like, or like interesting people on the internet is probably like the like one thing that seems like the best filter. But it's also not clear to what extent anything other than the interaction itself is doing the filtering. Like maybe there are lots of people that I like interact with once on the internet, and most of them I don't want to interact with again. So but I do think that I think I do think randos on the internet is like the best source of like interesting people.
Yeah.
But specifically not like any like not like Less Wrong or like anything like that, right? Like just like the internet in general.
Right. Yeah, this to me is extremely interesting because first I feel like I had a similar experience, but second because it's at some level it seems bizarre that there has not been such filtering invented by like someone with like interests or like style of general like attitudes towards to life and thinking styles that would filter for these kinds of things, and instead they're like sort of these kinds of filters and these kinds of filters and like random people on the internet. And
I don't know. I think so. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about why this hasn't happened. Like, if you, so I don't think you could put together a 6,000 person university of like weird people from the internet. Like maybe, but I think you'd have to get like all the weird people from the internet. Or like 6,000, sorry, 6,000, specifically 6,000 people between the ages of 18 and 22. So the type of filtering that Harvard needs to do, well, I don't know. I don't think they could. I think like my high school, or like you could imagine, I think a high school could do a better job of this. But then it's also like in a specific city, and like nobody's going to move to go to high school. So then like your high school has to be like then you have like a much smaller pool of people that you're drawing from. I don't know. Maybe like now that it's possible to do so many more things over the internet, we'll see this change with like more like niche groups.
right.
I guess also like what Harvard wants to filter for is people who will be like very legibly successful and therefore like, improve their brand. Or that's how they continue being like the most prestigious university in the world. And like it would be a big risk, at least for them, if they started filtering for like weirdos on the internet instead.
Yeah.
And then if you're a weirdo from the internet and that you're symmetrically by not going to Harvard and instead going to like weirdo from the internet university, like you're also taking a big risk because you're like foregoing like the number one like most prestigious thing. So I guess it seems like there's some sort of equilibrium that's like quite hard to break, at least in universities specifically.
Cool. So I guess next broad area of things I wanted to talk about was your professional career. And we sort of started with this, but you worked at like a bunch of places, and you interned at a bunch of
I interned at a bunch of places. I worked at one other place that wasn't Wave, but yes.
Yeah. So I think the first internship that you had, or like one of the first, was Jane Street. And you wrote in one of your blog posts that they like, at the time you thought that the thing that like the most satisfying thing to do is to like work on hard technical problems, and they give you some like really hard integrals to solve, and you're like afterwards you're like, well, probably just solving the most difficult technical problems is not the way to optimize for in the job. But I guess but the question that I'm coming towards is that I think, what exactly happened? Do you remember your thought process during your job of first or realizing that there probably like were a lot of interns there who were like very technically capable, and they were like, a lot of people do work at Jane Street and at other firms like Jane Street, and they do end up just like choosing this as a career, and they do end up like enjoying this job. And what was the difference in how you thoughts about your career that made you like decide not to choose it? Because there were the question also, sorry for interrupting, but finish the question. But because there are like good EA reasons to like get a job at Jane Street, and like a lot of people in the EA community as well get such jobs.
Yeah. Okay. So I do think that if you want to make a lot of money, like one of the most effective ways to do that is to like solve hard technical problems that nobody else can solve. Like the relationship is clear. Like you have a very rare skill, which is, I don't know, you can solve integrals that like other people are like, oh, like you can only do this numerically or whatever. So I think if you want to make a lot of money, like for instance because you like money or because you want to spend it all on bed nets or whatever, like I think solving like hard technical problems is like a pretty good way to do that. I don't know if it's the best way, but it's certainly like you'll make a lot of money with like pretty low variance. It seems pretty good, assuming you like have the ability to solve the hard technical problems. Like when I wrote the blog posts, which I think you're obliquely referencing, which is you don't have to work on hard problems, I mainly meant if you want to have a big impact on the world. I think like the thing that I assumed when I was interning at Jane Street and actually kept assuming for quite a while after that was some like basically I was like over applying the efficient market hypothesis or something. I was like, it can't possibly be the case that you can just write this app that like subtracts money from subtracts a number from one row in your database and adds a number to another row in your database, and it turns out that this is like insanely useful to millions of people. Actually, it turns out that you can, right? This is like what Wave does. But I didn't really realize that it was like actually possible to build things that had a like really large positive impact on the world without solving some hard problem that nobody else could solve. And I didn't actually realize that until after I started working at Wave. Or I didn't fully realize it until like after I started working at Wave. Whereas before then I was like, obviously somebody would have picked up that $500 million bill lying on the street. Like, yeah. And that was in fact false.
Yeah. I feel like this fits perfectly into my everlasting crusade against efficient market hypothesis being applied to your personal life as an individual. Where I think it like, I feel like similar things sort of happened to me, and I feel like similar thing happened to a lot of like people, analytically minded people who are like, or efficient market hypothesis makes so much sense. It must be like really true in life. And
it's so powerful. Somebody can ask you any question and you can be like, what does the efficient market hypothesis have to say about this? And it has something interesting to say, but it turns out, in fact, it also is often wrong. Because it makes the market is in fact not efficient, and like
I feel like the explanation that I think is most likely for that is that like one like crucial assumption of EMH is that there is enough capital in like hands of smart investors with good information, and that they can correct prices by using this capital. And like one problem with real life is that there's just a lot of problems and not enough people, like way not enough people to actually work on picking up all of the fruit. And
also transaction costs, right? Like there are like incredibly high transaction costs to
and transaction costs. Yeah. and yeah, and sort of, I don't know, the sort of the feeling that I have is that the number of problems like increases at a higher rate than the number of people who could be working on these problems. But this is as speculative as the exact extent to which AMH actually applies to anything.
So like I've actually been, so you studied economics, like maybe you know about this. I've been curious whether there have been any attempts made to like, I guess, quantify what happens even in like toy models when you like sort of when you break assumptions of the EMH, right? Like how inefficient should I expect the market to be if, I don't know, like transaction costs are like on the order of the price of the item, which is, I feel, is approximately true for, I don't know, buying things off Amazon. Like I spend like an approximately as large an amount of time like doing research and like trying to understand what the thing freaking is as I do as the money that I spend like actually buying the thing. So like how inefficient should I expect the market to be like based on this? Or if there are like if there's like a bunch of dumb money, how much should I expect like a given amount of dumb money relative to smart money to like distort the market? Does this research exist? Because if it does, I could just spend all day telling my efficient market hypothesis partisan friends that like they're wrong with it, instead of just only having anecdata.
Right. Yeah, I'm not really aware of such kind of research, but yeah, like my intuition is that once you introduce significant transaction costs, everything just breaks down. But my intuition is biased against economic models being robust to assumptions you choose. So I might be wrong here.
I think you're right that it breaks down, but I'm like it. Oh, okay, I see. So you're saying as soon as they're like at all, your intuition is that it breaks down very quickly as soon as the thing is like the transaction costs are present at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. At one point I considered trying to write a blog post in which I actually built a toy model in which like things traded a good or something, but I'm not good enough at figuring out like the right framework for a model such that like I thought it would actually tell me anything interesting.
Yeah, but maybe someone listening or viewing this video will end up coding this up and telling us the result.
Or just point me at a paper. I feel like some enterprising economist must have been like, oh, let me investigate the like limitations of this idea that like everyone in my profession like believes.
That is exactly the type of reasoning that probably does not hold.
Sigh.
Yeah, so okay, so this was Jane Street. And then you interned at GiveWell, right?
Yes.
How was interning at GiveWell, and like why didn't you stay there?
I think that I wasn't very good at doing research. Or at least relative to how good I was at, for instance, programming. I think the things that I did at GiveWell were like I wrote, I think, I forget what their term was for it, but basically like an investigation into whether like interventions to promote breastfeeding in developing countries could plausibly be highly effective. So for background, basically like breastfeeding is expected to have like various protective benefit. Breastfeeding instead of giving your children like baby formula is like expected to have various like benefits for the child. I think like in particular, like it's expected to be like immunoprotective because there are like various things in breast milk that is like hard to put in formula. But the prevalence of breastfeeding in developing countries is very low because of like extensive marketing campaigns by like infant formula suppliers like Nestle or whatever. Anyway, so I wrote this report. I found it like very exhausting because the amount of time that I had to, because of the percentage of my time that was devoted to answering the question of, oh, what is the next most important thing to look at, versus the percentage of my time that was devoted to actually like doing things, which is like very high. Basically, it was kind of difficult for me to do, it wasn't very conducive to like deep work, to having to always run in the back of your head the loop. Is this like the most useful like thing that I could be reading right now to answer my next question? It was just like a really, the quality of the studies was like not great. So it was just like a super fuzzy question with the criteria by which one might even answer it were not clear. And so, and I ended up writing a report, and the conclusion of the report was like, like maybe. And yeah, I don't really know what got done with that information, if anything. So, but anyway, like I felt like if I were programming right in the equivalent amount of time, I could have, I don't know, built like a cool app that like people would use. And I would have known like almost all the time, like what is the next most important thing for me to be working on. So yeah, I don't know if, I don't think this like research is like more demoralizing than like programming in some like abstract sense. But like maybe if I were like an equivalently good researcher as I was a programmer, I would have spent that entire month in a flow state and would have been like, yeah, like this is super awesome. But like in practice, I don't think that I was like a very good like researcher, and I was like a very good programmer. So I decided that it wasn't like my comparative advantage or something. I did still like get a lot out of my like internship, in particular, mostly from hanging out with Holden, who just, I guess, became one of my general role models for like how to do a good job of thinking about things. And I think, I guess like one that's sort of vague, one particular way in which it was like very useful to know, very useful to have spent time interacting with him, was that I think he was like a good antidote to many of the like memes that were going around the effective altruism community at that time that were the result of taking like very simple models way too seriously. And so I think Holden was very good at basically like taking these ideas and being like, wait, like this seems ludicrous. Like I don't believe it, just based on like common sense, but then actually like figuring out, okay, like what is the reason, like figuring out the actual case for not believing the like supposedly the ludicrous seeming thing that like the effective altruism community was very excited about. So I think, for instance, like that was a time during which like 80,000 hours was really pushing the idea of like replaceability. That is, when taking a job, you should consider like the counterfactual of like who would have the job instead of you. If that person would do an equally good job to you, then maybe it doesn't actually make any like counterfactually adjusted impact whether or not you take the job. It turns out that like if you look at like a really simple model, then it's true that like consideration is like important. But then if you layer in like more and more things about like how the real world works that are not accounted for by the very simple model, then it suddenly becomes like absurdly unclear, like to what extent like any job is actually replaceable or not. And then, so it turns out that most people like, or most of the time, replaceability should not be one of the primary things that you're thinking about when you like choose a career. And to 80,000 hours credit, by the way, they like updated, they stopped emphasizing that consideration nearly as much, and it's not really a core part of their like messaging anymore. But I think they agree in retrospect that it was like a mistake to focus on it so much. But it was like something that it's like a like contrarian, like clever idea that is good for getting press, but is not actually the right way to think about the
Wait,
the
this is
problem.
kind of like the story with earning to give.
Yeah, so replaceability is one of the like, it's replaceability is one of the things that you might think that earning to give is like much better than like various other things, right? Because like when you donate money, it's clear that whoever had that job in your place wouldn't be donating that money, and therefore you're like your donations are not replaceable. But there's a really robust case that like you're having like a positive counterfactually adjusted impact when you donate the money compared to if you try to do a job that is like being a doctor where you like directly save lives or something. Yeah. Anyway, so I think that there were a lot of this type of like meme flying around the effective altruism community, basically because it was like the early days, and it was really easy to, or it was the early days. People hadn't thought deeply about the actual right way to think about these things yet, and so instead there were a lot of. I think this is actually similar to the efficient market hypothesis. This was also the time when the EA community was like really obsessed with the efficient market hypothesis. And like people, this is again one of those things where it's like really easy to say like contrarian things that seem vaguely like they might be true by applying EMH, and then it turns out they're not actually the most important things to say, but you can like quickly get like mimetic traction by saying them. Anyway, I think Holden was like good at being immune to those things, and that was like really useful.
Yeah. Cool. So then I think at some point you tried to start a startup or something.
Gosh.
Let's not count.
No, I would say trying is a generous term. It was. I participated in something. Startup is also a generous term. Yeah. I guess I guess that sounds like silly enough that maybe I should describe what actually happened. But like Harvard had a startup competition, and I and some friends like entered the competition and won like second place or something. And so one of my summers at Harvard, I decided to like try to like work on this thing even more. I work on this like startup like full time with this pseudo startup. It had no customers. It never got to the point where it was like even plausible for it to get customers. We didn't realize that. I don't know. We were like very bad at doing startups. But so mostly I just sat around like sort of vaguely programming, but not really. But yeah, it could technically have been described as starting a startup, but only very technically.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then you took your first full-time job with Theorem LP.
Yep.
And how was that job, and why didn't you stay there?
Yeah, that was, let's see. I think it was like fine.
So sorry for again, but like so the reason I'm especially interested in this question is because again in one of your old blog posts you mentioned how that job was like at least twice as good as like the next best job, and it was interesting that despite this you ended up like leaving after a year and not staying there for longer term and like capitalizing on this. So
well, so that's the
what
thing about
happened?
power law distributions, right? Is that usually the top item in your sample is going to be like twice as good as the next item. But then if you keep sampling, like you're just going to have the same thing happen again. And in fact, that is what happened. I would say the difference between like Wave and Theorem was probably more like 10x than 2x, mostly based on like me being like an unusually good fit for that role. But right, yeah. So to get back to like how was it actually? So right. So Theorem was a company that used machine learning to score, to do credit scoring, basically. So this was during a time when a couple companies that did like peer-to-peer lending were getting very successful. So they were called like Prosper and Lending Club. And what they would do is like you could apply to them for a loan, But instead of them giving you a loan like with their own funds or something, like individual investors would sign up for a Prosper Lending Club account, and then they could buy like slices of your loan or fund slices of your loan. And at least for a while, I don't know if this is still true, but at least for a while, basically what Prosper and Lending Club were doing was they were like I'm not very confident in this because I didn't really dig in that much depth, but I suspect what they were doing was basically like arbitraging the fact that a lot of people have credit card debt because credit cards are one of the things that make it easiest to rack up debt. But credit cards are also like they have to charge super high interest rates because like of the fact that like it's a revolving loan. So when you default on a credit card, you're likely to have maxed out the balance, right? So defaults on credit cards are like really bad and you lose like most of your money, and you have to charge really high interest rates to make up for it. So if you refinance your credit card debt into like a fixed term loan, right? The people are not likely to default on their first payment of a fixed term loan. They're more likely to default like halfway through or something. And then you only lose half the money. So it's like much better. You can charge a much lower interest rate. And so like Prosper and Lending Club, basically like most of the reason they were successful is because they became like a good way to like refinance your credit card debt onto something that with a lower interest rate. And then it turned out that so they could ask you for a bunch of information that like I believe for regulatory reasons like they weren't allowed to use in their credit scoring algorithms. But investors, what they would do is like they would underwrite the loan, and then like later investors would buy it. And so the investors could look at all this extra information that like was not able to be used in the underwriting decision, and you could get some amount of alpha from like that information. And so what Theorem did was it basically ran a hedge fund that bought like the best loans on these platforms, and then made like pretty good interest for like relatively little risk, or at least relatively little. There was like some macroeconomic risk that like we had no idea what it was because like the economy had never been through a downturn while these peer-to-peer lending platforms were in business. So you didn't know like how correlated would defaults be when like the macroeconomy became very bad. So now we probably actually know that. I guess I should probably go back and like, look at what happened to Prosper and Lending Club during COVID. But at least at that time, like there was, aside from macroeconomic risk, it was just like you could make a really good return by being good at credit scoring. So what I actually did at that job was I basically worked on I improved so I did two things. One is I like worked on improving our machine learning models. And then the second was like, I worked on like putting the machine learning models into production. It was like pretty fun. I learned a lot about machine learning. I got to write some cool like blog posts about machine learning. I think like ultimately what I later realized was that it was not very motivating because ultimately the company was not constrained on its ability to do good machine learning. It turns out that if you threw like a halfway decent model at this problem, like you would just do pretty well. And then like the amount that you could improve on that was like limited by the fact that like, defaults were very rare. And so your return was basically capped by the like average interest rate of the loan that you were buying. And so like model improvements were like kind of useful, but like, not really that useful. And in reality, what this company needed was like more like people who were good at hedge fund sales. And so like I spent like a little while trying to do hedge fund sales. I like sort of almost convinced one guy to invest in our hedge fund, but that was like close to the time that I left. And I think after I left, he like didn't end up investing in the hedge fund. And like also it was like a guy that I like previously knew, right? So I was garbage at like actual hedge fund sales. I was just like, I was doing the same thing that I did at Harvard Effective Altruism of like, oh, like I'm clearly garbage at this thing, but nobody else is around to do it, so let me do it. Anyway, so like in retrospect, I was like kind of demotivated because of realizing that like the company was like not actually constrained by like the thing that I was like supposed to be working on. But like I didn't realize that at the time because I had never worked at a place that was good at like allocating resources only to the things that it was constrained on.
Yeah, so it took you like 4 like attempts at working at different kinds of jobs to like finally get to the place where you're to Wave, where you've been for like 5 years or something.
Yeah, probably. I don't know. It depends on how you count, but approximately 4.
Yeah, we so this particular thing or like the number is interesting to me because I feel like the reason you ended up like finding Wave was because I guess you like realize we're not satisfied with just like working on machine learning somewhere or being a software engineer somewhere. And I feel like it's common to expect that you will figure like the first or second or like the third job will definitely be the job that like you should be working on. If you have not, and if even the second or the third job that you're doing is you don't feel like working on it for more than half a year, then there must be something wrong with you. And yeah, your story is interesting. Just from the perspective of it took you like since your first internship, and since it was like 4 or 5 years before you find the job that you're really good fit for, and it took
Yeah.
you like,
In fact, I think it's even worse than that because I didn't realize that my problem with Theorem was that I didn't feel like working on it until I knew what it felt like to work on something that felt actually important. There were many such things. Like similarly, like I didn't realize how important it was to like have a good manager until I started working with Drew, the CEO of Wave, who's it was like, at least for me, who's like an incredible manager, who like gave me like by far like way more useful like self-improvement feedback than like anyone else that I had worked with up until that point. So but I did not know how good any of those things would have been, or like I didn't realize, even when I joined Wave, I didn't realize that to what degree it was a better place for me than like the place that I was previously working. And that was despite, so like the way that I realized that I should leave Theorem and join Wave was actually like so I was not Wave's first engineer. Their first engineer was my then girlfriend, whom I had preferred there. And then I kept looking over her shoulder and being like, oh, huh, it seems like the thing that you're doing is like much more fun than like the thing that I'm doing. And then after about 9 months of that, I was like, man, fuck this. And in fact, I think the thing that like, yeah. And I simultaneously realized that like earning to give was like a bad strategy because like I fully internalized the fact that like, Dustin Moskovitz had like, $8 billion and whatever money I like made was like not going to be like $8 billion. And so anyway, so it was like, so I in fact like didn't even realize the extent to which I should have been dissatisfied with all of the other things that I had done until like afterwards. In fact, like I'm still not sure the degree to which like I should have been dissatisfied with those, right? I don't know whether everyone should expect to be able to find a company like Wave within their first 5 attempts at changing jobs, or whether I got super lucky and in fact other people should expect to take so many attempts to find like a company that's equally good that like it in fact is not like, then they in fact should stop searching like earlier. Yeah, it's a very tricky problem. I don't have a great answer to.
yeah, so you ended up it seems to me it's not obvious why Wave is such a great opportunity compared to, I don't know, compared to what? It's like, it's a financial services company, right? It like works on transfers. And again, like by EMH, we would expect that there would be a bunch of companies already like doing money transfers. And in fact, like there are a ton of companies doing money transfers in general, like both in developing world and in developed world, and like between the US and Africa,
Yeah.
and within the US and Africa probably. And so like, why is Wave such a great opportunity?
Yeah, that's a good question to which I also don't have a full answer. So I guess I should clarify the thing that Wave is doing now, which I think is like the thing that I'm like most excited about is we're doing money transfer within, we're building mobile money systems within various countries in Africa. So these things are basically, we provide the same services to people that banks provide, but we, instead of having bank branches, we have agents that are scattered all throughout the country that are like shopkeepers who use their spare cash to service Wave customers' transactions. So you'll go to an agent, deposit your money, and then you have balance in your Wave account that you can like send on to somebody else or something like that. And so because it's a lot easier to open up a new agent than to open up a new bank branch, we can provide dramatically better service at a lower price point than banks can.
Right. So that's like regulatory arbitrage essentially.
I'm calling it an arbitrage is strong. There are like explicit regulations that you must comply with in order to be like a mobile money provider. It's just like countries in Africa realized that you can't start a good bank in Africa because building branches is too expensive relative to the average account size. And so they decided that they decided that in addition to banks, they would allow people to build like mobile money things.
Right.
But anyway, so yes, so there are regulations specifically on like that you must comply with in order to be mobile money. And the question is like, why aren't there other like good mobile money systems in Africa? And I don't know the full answer to that question. It feels to me like you probably could have started effectively Wave like 4 years before Wave was actually started and like, done a reasonably good job. You would have had a slightly harder time because like fewer people would have smartphones, but nothing like super fundamental would be different. So I'm not sure of the full answer to this question. Like part of the answer I think is like part of the answer is clearly like the efficient market hypothesis is false. I think that, so I actually wrote a blog post that was sort of about this, which you may or may not have been obliquely referencing, but it's called Why and How to Start a Startup Serving Emerging Markets or something like that. And the theory that blog post outlines is that basically there are very few people who have both spent a lot of time in one of the like clusters of the world that produces great technology products, and then would also are also happy to, instead of continuing to live there, go live in like a place in Africa where they would learn enough of like local context to be able to build a great product that like solves people's problems in those countries. I think that is like one of the key differentiators of Wave is that, and it's not like there are 0 people with this trait, to be clear, but there are like very few relative to like of all of the people who like live in Silicon Valley, right, and are excited to start a tech company, I would guess that probably under 0.1% of them would be like excited to live in Africa for 4 years. Drew, the founder of Wave, has, right?
Right.
Maybe it's higher than that actually now, because YC is now admitting a substantial number of companies from Africa where the founders are from Africa, although that wasn't the case when Wave was started. Anyway, so that's a sense in which like the market is like, so instead of tech entrepreneurs building the original crop of mobile money systems, they were all built by telecoms. And if you're a telecom and you're building a mobile money system, this mobile money system is by far the most complex product you have ever put in front of a consumer. And so the default is you're going to do a terrible job at it because you have never had to make something simple before, or take something complex and make it simple. And there's one telecom that did a really great job of this, which is Safaricom, the company that like ran the OG mobile money system, M-Pesa. And our current theory about why that worked was that basically like M-Pesa was run effectively as a startup, like without very much interference by Safaricom, whereas all of the like copycats in other countries were like run as like business units of the telecom. So they like took one of their like telecom execs and they were like, hey, you like start a mobile money system. And the exec was like, okay, let me hire a bunch of engineers and like buy something off the shelf from like Ericsson or Huawei or something. And then if you want to change your software, you have to like file a ticket with Huawei, and then 12 hours later, the Huawei's engineers like respond to your ticket and they're like, we can't do this or whatever. Anyway, so it was much harder for them to execute well than it was for like Safaricom. So I guess that's the reason why the EMH is not a good argument that like Wave wasn't a good like opportunity. I guess, okay, sorry, I should first have given the like actual argument for like why is Wave a great opportunity. The reason Wave is a great opportunity is because it allows people to transfer money instantly at like much lower prices than they like previously could. It turns out this is, if you were, for instance, like a fish trader in Senegal, this is like life-changingly awesome, because you go from having to, for instance, you send fish to a market somewhere else in Senegal, people sell the fish, get money, and they send the money back to you. And as soon as you get the money, you buy your next load of fish. So if the money is coming back like on a bus, then like it takes another day for you to get your money back. If the money comes back via Wave, you get it instantly, and you can buy your second load of fish instantly. And that means that if it takes you one day to buy the fish and then one day to get the money back, Wave is effectively letting you buy twice as many fish with your given stock of capital. And therefore you have doubled your income. Okay, it turns out people like doubling their income. Therefore, like Wave is like a really useful product to them. So sorry, that I guess that part should have gone first, but that's why. And so it was a great opportunity because like we built a product that people really loved, and therefore it grew really, really fast and is now used by over 25% of all the adults in Senegal, for instance. And it doesn't seem like there's any reason why we should not succeed equally well elsewhere. So it's exciting to be able to potentially build the economic rails of like much of sub-Saharan Africa. And then the first half of my answer is why nobody else did this 4 years ago, maybe.
Great. Yeah, no, this does sound, now this sounds really impactful, more than just like payments, international payments or something. Oh, I guess it wasn't international payments in the first place, but.
So our first product was international payments. Yeah. So we were sending money from the US to Kenya, and we would deliver the money using M-Pesa, the OG mobile money system that I described earlier. The reason that we started Wave was actually that we tried to expand that to other countries. And that was when we realized that it looked like they had mobile money systems. If you looked them up on Wikipedia, they had mobile money systems, but the mobile money systems were all like shit. They were like really bad. And so we were like, oh, this sucks for our product because it's not growing as fast in these other markets because like we're delivering to like much worse mobile money systems. But it was great for us because it meant we could just build a better mobile money system. And that was like, that's like a much more exciting product than just like international money transfer, because the theoretically can be used by like everyone in the country, not just like people whose relatives managed to emigrate.
Yeah, so the next couple of questions that I wanted to ask you are less about your like, not about your job, but like these general questions that people usually ask in interviews, where you try to learn something really insightful from the person you're interviewing, rather than like a bunch of details of from their lives. But so yeah, so the first thing of this kind is, what do you find yourself disagreeing with your friends about?
I think that I am like, so we already discussed, I guess, not taking the efficient market hypothesis very seriously. I think there's some communities that I'm part of that take it like way too seriously, but I think like even with respect to many friends, I am like somewhat more likely to try to take like an inside view and less likely to put weight on like efficient market hypothesis considerations. So I think like one example where like ex post I was clearly right and like many friends were clearly wrong was that like I thought like waves of equity is going to be very valuable, and I like tried to tell people that this was true, and they were like, but efficient markets and like startups and like venture capitalists and whatever. And I was like, no, VC markets are like extremely inefficient, like whatever. Anyway, I don't know if like ex ante I was actually like, right.
But the base rates. But
yeah. So I don't know if ex ante I was right about this, but like ex post I like clearly was right. Waves like equity has like gone up a lot more than the people who thought that it wouldn't thought.
Right. Might not be the best thing to share in the thing that will be published on YouTube.
But I think it's fine to share like directions. I will not disclose how much it's gone up, but I don't know. I like, for instance, I don't think any of those people's predictions was like compatible with like us building a mobile money system that was like used by 25% of people in Senate. But like more generally, like I was fine. I was roughly, I was much more comfortable than those people were being like, okay, it looks like we're like going to succeed at building this mobile money thing. Then if you look at like how valuable of a business that like should be, like, gosh, like it looks really good. And okay, yeah, we're raising at this like much lower valuation. And that's because like venture capitalists don't understand Africa, and the VC markets are like silly, and like we're trading off speed for like trying to optimize valuation. And they were like, why would somebody ever trade off like speed for trying to optimize valuation? Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I think to be clear, I don't want to use first principles reasoning like that very much. I think it required me to in order to be right, even assuming like that I am right about it, or that I was right about it ex ante, which is like hard to say. Maybe I got lucky. But like even assuming I was right about it ex ante, like it requires a lot of context and like specific knowledge to get, and that context and specific knowledge is like hard to acquire. But I think at least for like career decisions, I think you want to get to a point where you can use inside views instead of being like, oh, the base rate is X or something like that.
But like this thing about base rates and like you being disagreeing with your friends about this, how much of this was the fact that you were like inside of this thing and saw the details versus you're just like general like thinking actually working differently? And if it's in significant part of like you're thinking at the time being different, like the style of your thinking, how did that come about?
I think the causation went in the other direction. That is, I saw a wave like clearly like just destroy the efficient market hypothesis, and then I was like, oh wait, wow, like the efficient market hypothesis here was like so wrong. Like maybe I should stop like paying as much attention to like efficient market hypothesis type arguments.
Right.
So the update was caused, at least in part, by witnessing firsthand like just like, absurdly like inefficient market.
Okay, this makes sense. Yeah.
And I guess witnessing, like comparing like the type of reasoning that like the founders of Wave employed to find the like efficient market versus the type of reasoning, or to find the idea and like then turn it into a great company, versus like the type of like outside view reasoning that like people EMH partisans use to like evaluate like whether something is like worth doing or not. which like basically like when I joined Wave, I had a number of like conversations with Drew where I like said something about base rates, and then he was basically like, "Fuck base rates, man." And I was like, "No, but don't you understand like base rates?" And he was like, "No." And then eventually I realized that like, that was like part of why Drew was effective. And yeah, I don't know. There's a really good like blog post by on applied divinity studies. Which I forget the title, but if you have show notes, maybe we can put it in the show notes. Where he basically hypothesizes that the reason there are so few successful entrepreneurs in the like rationality or effective altruism communities is that these communities put like too much weight on outside view type argument, or like these communities train people to put a lot of weight on outside view type arguments. I think that's like pretty much correct.
Yeah.
And that basically like the reason that I stopped doing it was that I like saw firsthand that, oh, like the effective entrepreneurs that I am like interacting with every day, like basically do not reason in this style at all. I think it's pretty good for having a low variance, like moderately positive outcome. I think like ignoring outside views is like very high variance. Like a lot of the time, like you're wrong. So for instance, before they built Wave, the founders of Wave built 10 unsuccessful social mobile apps. And like they were doing the thing. They were sampling from a heavy-tailed distribution over and over again. And then finally they got like a sample that was like a gazillion instead of 0. But at first they drew 10 zeros.
Huh. Were you not bothered by the 10 unsuccessful social media companies that came before Wave when you were joining?
No, Wave was like obviously succeeding at that point.
Oh.
So.
Yeah. What are the things that you like disagree with like EA community at large about? Like today, not like over the years, I guess there was this thing with earning to give, like how exactly valuable that is. But but like today, if like the EA community is like very like well shifted focus significantly towards like long-term risks and like long-term things, and you're working on the sort of the thing that like on the one hand like the thing that like EA community would, and I have a feeling would never consider super valuable because it's like on the one hand not like super explicitly long-term directed, but at the same time it's like direct work in a way that like
I think the EA community is like pretty into. So I think the EA community believes that given a worldview on which like it is valuable to work on global poverty, like working at Wave is one of the best things that you can do. So like for instance, we're like EA approved enough that our like job postings appear on the 80,000 hours job board. They don't appear on the we think these are extra great section, but they appear on the we think these are like they appear in the like other opportunities that might be promising section or something. So I think that basically I think even the like global poverty wing of the like EA community has shifted away from earning to give as like the be all and end all, and towards sort of more pluralistic, like you should like actually try and like, do things yourself route. In terms of what I disagree with the current EA community about, yeah, I don't know. I think I've stopped following them as I've stopped following it as closely or like engaging with it as much as I did like in the past. So I don't, it's a bit harder for me to say than it would have been. I guess, I don't know. Possibly one of the things that I like, I guess maybe like you presumably the EA community believes that like the EA community is like more interesting than I believe the EA community is, in the sense that it's not really once you do the thing where or it kind of seems like there's a bit less there than there was like in the early days of the EA community, and that it's just like a bunch of people working on long-termism stuff that's like valuable under this one worldview, and then like a bunch of people working on global poverty stuff that's like valuable according to this other worldview, and like a bunch of people working on like animal welfare stuff that like is like valuable under this like third worldview. And it's the worldviews are quite different. It's like unclear that they get that much from engaging with each other. They have very different ways of doing like epistemology and like cause prioritization. And so what is there actually left to like effective altruism overall? Like it's hard exactly to say. If you strip out the like particular parts of each of those worldviews that are like pretty different, is there some sort of common core other than like these people hang out with each other a lot? Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the community, it's not like there's like the community isn't very monolithic, or yeah, I guess it's like it's hard to see what's like going on there that's like super interesting right now.
Right.
Divorced from the work on the particular cause areas that a lot of EAs think are important, which like there's like various interesting stuff that like if you're interested in AI risk, there's a lot of interesting AI risk related stuff going on.
Right.
Like, but like general EA stuff, I don't know, it just seems kind of weird that it's like a thing.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so I think I actually asked you everything I wanted to ask you.
Cool.
So I don't know, do you think there's anything fun that we can talk about, or that you expected I would ask you, or that you thought that it would be fun to talk about that we did not end up talking about?
To be honest, I expected you to ask interesting questions, and you did. I didn't spend a lot of time like preparing for what I imagined you might ask about, because I figured you'd probably ask better questions than I could come up with yourself, and you delivered. They were great questions, super fun to talk, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for taking the time, and I'll edit this at some point, and it will appear on YouTube at some point.
Sweet. Excited for that. Thanks again.
Cool. Yeah, it was great talking, and see you. Bye.
You too. Bye.